Hello. We spent a few minutes looking at, and actually some more time shooting in a shallow depth of field. So now we're going to move on to step 2 of the assignment, which is looking at a wide, deep depth of field, or something that I call a storytelling depth of field. And you achieve that by having a tight aperture. So something at f, maybe f9.5 or above, generally f11, somewhere above that. You would really want to focus on having a wider angle lens, a small aperture, and keeping some distance from your subject in the background and stuff so that they're all easier to keep in focus. Remember that the smaller the aperture, the wider your depth of field gets. That means the distance between what's in focus and what is not in focus, the distance of stuff that is in focus becomes larger. So what we're going to do right now is take a quick look at a couple of photos that have that wide, deep depth of field, that storytelling depth of field, where your eye can go all through the picture and see from the close stuff, the near the foreground, into the middle distance, into the background. And that idea of the storytelling depth of field, that came to, I got that from a book called Understanding Exposure by, I believe, Brian Peterson, which is the first book on photography I ever read. And he said there's 3 real apertures or depths of field that you would play with. There's the shallow depth of field for portraits. There's the who cares depth of field, where there is no 3-dimensionality, like you're shooting something that's 2D, like a flat lay kind of picture, or somebody standing against a wall, and you just want maximum sharpness. And then there's the storytelling depth of field, where the picture is really 3-dimensional and you're going through it. So let's take a look at some of those 3D storytelling kind of depth pictures right up here. The first one is something that I shot myself a couple of weeks ago on Flying Mountain in Maine in Acadia National Park. So if you see there's me in the red. If you can't make it good, make it red. That's a compositional trick. Red always sticks out. And you can see there's a clear kind of 3 levels in the picture. There's like the foreground is that first kind of triangle. And let me just mouse over that. Maybe that'll show this area here is foreground, and then you've got this middle distance down here with the field, and then the ocean and all the stuff is in the background. All of it is sharp and in focus. If you zoom in, you can see, like, if you were to make a big print of this, it would work. People wouldn't say like, oh yeah, but that part's blurry. And that's 1/30th of a second at f13, ISO 100. Again, this is 1/60th of a second, f16. The lens I'm using is a 35mm prime lens that maximum aperture is f16. So I've got all that maxed out, ISO 100, so I get my best colors. And the trees down here in the foreground are in focus. The trees in the middle ground are in focus. And then all the way back here into the background and the fog and stuff, it all goes through. Everything works there. So, and it's got pretty light, the sun just coming from there, and it's very soft. And I like that picture. I was pleased with that, even though I had to climb up a mountain at 5 in the morning to get it. If you're noticing a pattern, these are all shot at f16 pretty much, or almost all of them. When I want to get everything in focus, that's the easiest thing to do. But with this, you've got the rocks in the foreground and the reflection of the sunset, and it goes straight through. The trees are basically in focus too. When you stop your aperture all the way down to 16 or whatever your maximum is, you also get these rays if you shoot into the sun, the sunbursts. So that's, and it looks different depending on how many blades are in your aperture, but that's, just know that if you stop it down, you shoot it into the sun, you'll get that kind of cool effect. 1/20th of a second, f11, ISO 100, so not f16, but still, it looks like pretty much everything is in focus here. So sometimes it's just, you use the maximum aperture you need to get everything in focus. And if you don't have to go to f16, don't, because you're not going to, at that point you're not getting diffraction, which actually cuts out maybe everything's in focus, but it's not as sharp as it could be. For the most part, I don't really worry about diffraction. I feel like you sharpen it back in post, and like only nerds are really going to notice that. Most people, if it's a beautiful picture, they're not going to say, but it's 95% as sharp as it could be. If you had that extra 5%, it would really be a great shot. Like, you'll find internet trolls that will do that, but who cares what they think? And then last one, this is Little Long Pond. This was with an 85mm lens. The other ones were all with a 35mm. But again, I'm at f16, ISO 280, because this is right in the sunrise, 1/15th of a second, which is about as slow as I can hand hold it. And you've got sharp reeds in the foreground, and then It's not quite as sharp in the background because with an 85 millimeter, that's going to start cutting into your depth of field a little bit, but it's still what I would call acceptably sharp there. And it takes you right through the whole picture. You've got this whole, it leads you right through into this little gap here, and there's the clouds and the fog on the mountain and all that stuff. So that's the basics of this kind of storytelling aperture and a deep depth of field. Tamp that aperture down, stop it down as much as it'll, by making the number as high as possible, f16, 22, some 30 something, and then keep your shutter speed as fast as you need to make it to make sure that you don't get motion blur, and then just adjust your ISO to make sure that the exposure comes out the way that you want it to.
So I'm going to be shooting today using a 35 millimeter lens, which is wider than the 50 millimeter. That doesn't mean you guys should shoot at 35. You should probably go more like 20, 24, somewhere around there because of the different kinds of sensors in our cameras and math that I'm not going to get into. But generally you want to stay back a little bit from your subject so that you can get that extra depth of field, zoom out, and tighten your aperture down. And then just adjust your shutter speed and your ISO accordingly to make it all work. So now we're going to walk around Rawlins Savannah and see if we can find some places that need more depth of field. I came out here because landscapes tend to be where you want to get everything from the foreground to the middle ground to the background all in focus so you can tell a real story with what's going on. So let's see what we can find. Okay, so here I am, and we're going to try our first kind of landscapey shot. And on my camera here, I'm shooting right now at 1/1500th of a second, ISO 100 f1.8. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move my aperture to something that I would consider kind of a landscapey aperture. So f11, that's not as small as it'll go. I can go all the way up to f22, and we can try that in a second and see what the difference is. But let's start with f11. And then I'm going to bring my shutter speed down to something that I can handle, which this lens has a stabilizer on it. So if you have that, turn that on. That'll let you turn your shutter speed down a bit. Right now, looking at my histogram, I am actually okay at f11, 1/60th of a second, ISO 100. I know the assignment says to start at ISO 800, but if you don't need it, don't use it because you'll get extra grain. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for something. I want to get kind of this matted down grass where the deer slept, and then also the purple stuff. Purple, those are called flowers, yeah, purple flowers. And then maybe that tree in the background. So let's see if I can get all that kind of in focus. So I'm going to set my focus point somewhere not very in the front, kind of in the middle third there. So I'm focusing right on the edge where the purple grass becomes the flowers. And then I'm actually I'm going to tilt it up and down so I get more of that foreground. And then let's see what my shot looks like. That's pretty good focus. If I want to increase my depth of field, I can just, let's go that up to f16. Let's go all the way to 22. And then I'm just going to drop my shutter speed until I get that histogram right in the middle, right about there, 1/10 of a second. And I'm not even going to bother to refocus because the focus point should work the same. And that one came out okay too. Maybe I go vertical. We'll get even a little bit more of that foreground sense. Cool. The reason why I focus a little ways into the picture is because your focal point is going to have a lot behind where you focus, like farther in the distance, but also some in front of where you focused. So when you're trying to get maximum depth of field, you go about 1/3 of the way into the distance and find a focal point somewhere in there. To me, that was somewhere right on the edge of the grass, and that way I'm going to get everything behind it in focus until I run out of focus, range, and then a bit in front of it as well. So hopefully I'll get the whole frame in focus. That's called looking for the hyperfocal point, where you get the maximum amount of sharpness in the picture. I don't do it in a very mathematical way. Some people really like to geek out about the numbers. I just figure a little ways into the frame so that it's not too bad. That's what I do. Okay, so now this one is kind of a classic kind of shot that you might want to do for some landscapey stuff, because we've got these long leading lines going right down through this boardwalk, and that's kind of a cool photographic element. So I'm going to see what kind of shot I can get there. So looking at my camera, let's start it recording. Right now my exposure is about the same as it was because the light hasn't changed much. It's actually a little bit brighter because it's about 8:15 in the morning and the sun is slowly coming up. So I've increased my shutter speed to 1/15 of a second. I'm going to go right down, smack down the middle of this, and then focus right about there, and try and level my horizon and fire off a shot. That's pretty good. Let's try a vertical. And as I said yesterday, when we're shooting like multiple versions of the same basic picture, those don't count as different pictures, right? Oh, that's kind of cool too. And maybe I'll do this one pointing down more. I'm trying to do it without getting my shadow in the shot. Something like that. And then one like that. And maybe, let me get in a little bit closer and get lower. See what that does. That's going to accentuate the actual boardwalk coming in, makes the perspective look bigger. And we're going to start losing a little bit of focus right in the very foreground there. But not too much. At f/22, that's basically coming in. And I'm still looking at my own shadow and hoping it doesn't wreck everything. I'm going to set my focus point more towards the middle just to keep, it keeps throwing me off. I keep thinking, is that in the middle or not? Nobody will see that in the final picture, but yeah. So that looks pretty good. I think when I'm looking for something that I need to shoot in a wide depth of field, I'm looking for a place where it's three-dimensional, right? Like there's a long, you can see the picture goes in. So you look for these kind of parts where you've got like straight lines where the lines start to converge in the distance. Or you look for a cool path that's got like an S-curve kind of thing going on. So we're gonna keep going this way because it gets more fun. So I want to remind you, each time I'm taking a new scene, I shoot 3 or 4 or 5 different versions of that. And those aren't 4 or 5 different pictures in my mind. They're different versions of one picture, and I pick the one that's best. So even though I shot 4 pictures right over there as I was coming onto the boardwalk, I wouldn't turn in all 4 of those and be like, you tell me which one is best. It's your job as the student to decide which one is your best shot and give me that version. So now this might not come out that good. I kind of couldn't help it because there's an egret over there and a great blue heron over there. I don't have a long lens, so I probably won't be able to get them. But we're going to try and shoot and see what we can do. So I'm already recording there, that's good. And let's just check my exposure. Exposure looks good. What I'm going to see if I can do is use some of this pond scum to make sort of an interesting element there. So like have that lead us through. And I'm trying to pay attention to my horizon line to make sure that that's fairly level. Because there's nothing like a tilted horizon, like slightly tilted, to make you look really unprofessional and like you don't know what you're doing. And then this one, I'm just going to make it a little bit more of a conventional kind of, we'll bring the sky into a little bit more. We'll speed up that shutter to drop down that exposure so that the sky's not blown out. 1/20th of a second, f/22. The light meter at the bottom says I'm underexposed a little bit, but I think I'll be okay. And then I just accidentally hit the focus button. Let's try that. Yeah, I don't really like those pictures. It's not very well balanced because the trees and stuff. So we're gonna keep moving. I probably wouldn't even turn those ones in. But you never know until you shoot it. So generally, if I see something that I think maybe that's cool, shoot it now. You can always come back and shoot it later. Like I could come back tomorrow morning with a telephoto lens and try and get some of these guys because they'll be back. They're here like every day. Okay, let's keep moving. This one's pretty cool just because I like the way that the shadows kind of lead into the frame. And then there's all these big yellow flowers and the bench there in the distance. I feel like I might be able to get a decent shot with that. So let's see what we can get here. So looking at that, light meter says I'm overexposed, which is surprising. But my histogram says I'm just fine. So I'm gonna trust the histogram. And I'm gonna try and make those flowers look as big as possible. So I'm gonna raise the camera up and then tilt it down a bit so that they're kind of like near the top of the frame. And then maybe take a step forward, get a little bit less of that shadow in here. And I think that's a fairly decent shot. It doesn't, I'm not gonna win awards with it, but right now we're playing with the concept of what you would wanna do. So this is the shot that I was kind of waiting for because I was just thinking this would be the best one. It's got the most interesting light going in here, kind of the dappled shadows, and we've got this like crooked kind of boardwalk going through, so it's more interesting shapes to deal with. So let's see what we can get for a picture here. It's also gonna mean we're gonna change our exposure the most of any of the pictures that we've done because it's darker. Right now it's saying I'm 3 stops underexposed. So I'm going to boost my ISO because I don't really want to change my shutter speed any more than I have to. I want to keep those dark shadows, but I don't want to lose any of my highlight kind of information. So I'm going to go over this way and maybe raise it up. Let's see what that looks like. That's kind of cool. And I didn't even notice when I was first looking at this branch, big thick branch that's going, but it's highlighted by some of the sunlight. So I might bring that into the picture a little bit more. Let's try that again. I can't exactly see what I'm doing there, so I have to keep reviewing. Normally I'd be shooting mostly through the viewfinder, but that gets turned off when you're using one of these Atomos recorders. Let's try it like that. That shows me a little bit more of the boardwalk as it goes in through a distance. We can try a vertical, see what that does. And get right in the middle there. Focus maybe on that leaf. That should give us enough depth of field to really work with. Now, depending on the camera that you're using, you may get more or less depth of field with the aperture that you have. The Canon Power Shoots, those probably have the most depth of field. What they're going to really struggle with is the previous exercise where people are trying to get a shallow depth of field and really blur out the background. A cell phone, if you see portrait mode on an iPhone or whatever the equivalent is on Android, that's using software to blur out the background because cell phones have such a hard time blurring anything out. That really boils down to the size of the sensor in the camera. The larger the sensor, the shallower your depth of field is going to be, which is great for portraits, maybe not as good for landscapes. So with an iPhone, if you go, you're going to get, like, everything's going to be in focus from front to back, as long as you don't force it to not do that. With the T6s that most of my students have, you're going to be somewhere in the middle. But f/22, you're probably going to get everything in focus. Technically, f8, f11 tend to be a little bit sharper because of something called diffraction, which we're not going to get into. For the most part, I'd rather have everything in focus and not have to do fancy computer stuff to like focus stack it and sacrifice 5% of sharpness, which I can just mostly bring back to the eye by sharpening it on the computer. Nerds will freak out and say I'm blaspheming right here, but who cares? Most of the time, the people looking at your pictures are not nerds. They're just like, that's cool. I like that shot. That's what we're shooting for. All right, I think we have our shots. So just like the last one, slap them into the Google slideshow that you were given. Make sure you put the settings at the bottom and turn it in. Cool. I look forward to seeing what you come up with.